the government 3 or 4 days ago announced, pretty much as a consequence of the coalition agreements that they've signed with both the ACT and the New Zealand First parties, that they will be doing an independent review at least commissioning an independent panel of experts to review agricultural biogenic methane science and targets for consistency with no additional warming. Agriculture Minister Todd McClay says the coalition government has been clear in its commitment to maintain a split gas approach to our domestic climate change targets, and I talked about methane being separated out from other global warming gases, particularly carbon emissions, and how that is going to be dealt with to do with our international obligations and also what it means. Now, as I also pointed out to Treasury, who I've not got a lot of time for Treasury, as you've probably worked out, because I tend to find that most of their prognostications turn out to be wrong, and I'm always amazed. I mean, you wouldn't keep on going to the doctor if you kept on getting the melody wrong and gave you the wrong medicine. But anyhow, that's Treasury. They are estimating something between $5 and $25 billion worth of money will need to be spent throughout the entire economy to deal with New Zealand's international obligations. The fact that there's such a quantum difference between those two sums is neither here nor there. The fact is that it is going to cost us to meet our international obligations. Now, some time ago, the last government, set up essentially an independent body of its own. Well, it was meant to be independent. I mean, you would have thought. The Climate Change Commission. And their review, or their aim, is to provide independent advice to the government of the day, evidence-based advice that will guide climate change action for New Zealand, and particularly for the obligations that we've made internationally and how we're going to get there and whether or not we're getting there. The Climate Change Commission was about, as I understand, to announce its latest review of how we're going on that particular road. But the government announcement came beforehand and proved something to a surprise in certain news sources. Joining us to talk about that and where to from here is the chairman of the Climate Change Commission, Dr. Rod Carr, and he joins us now. Rod, lovely to hear from you again. How are you?
I'm very well, Michael, and it's good to hear your voice too.
How's the family? Just first of all, everybody well?
Family's all well, kids, children, grandchildren, all the whole kit and caboodle, going well. Thanks, mate.
Good on you. I was just saying, I've got Craig Stober on as a guest after 12 on other issues, but I was just saying the old debating team's back together again today.
Yeah, we should do that one day.
You should. Okay, mate. Now, you heard my introduction and you know what the government said on the 6th of April, the 4 ministers in their joint announcement. First of all, just take me through this. The Climate Change Commission was set up to do what, Rod?
Yeah. Climate Change Commission was set up by Parliament. 119 members of a 120-member Parliament voted to establish the Commission back in 2019. So a surprising degree of unanimity at that time that a body that was independent of the government of the day should provide evidence-based and expert advice to help governments make decisions. So the Commission makes no decisions. We only give advice. That Parliament prescribed for us not only what advice we should give and by when, but also that we should consult about our advice before we finalised it. And so we're on a timeline set by Parliament which includes a 5-yearly review of New Zealand's emissions targets. And our review is due to be handed in its final form to the government by the 31st of December this year. And the Act describes the criteria that would need to be met for the Commission to recommend a change in targets, and if the criteria are met, what the target should be changed to. So in line with our You Must Consult, we've put out a discussion paper, and that's what came out on Monday, that says here's how we are thinking about our emissions targets in line with the criteria set by Parliament. What do you New Zealanders think about the evidence and the reasoning? And if we're missing evidence and got the reasoning wrong, here is 8 weeks in which you can draw to our attention better reasoning better evidence.
Okay, so I'm assuming you've got a website or something like that.
Absolutely, people can, website, yep. Climate Change Commission. You can get all the docos, you can download it, you can see what we're thinking, and more importantly, make submissions. Tell us you got it wrong because here's some evidence about that you might not be aware of. Because we are looking for the evidence that will help give good advice to the government. But I also make the point. The Climate Change Commission is not the exclusive advisor to the government on climate matters. The government gets advice from other government agencies, it gets advice from peak industry bodies, it gets advice from stakeholders with vested interests, and so it should. Because at the end of the day, it's the government that makes these decisions, not the Commission.
Okay, I understand that. But having said, why do I need you then, Rod? Because if the government's getting advice from a whole series of other positions and yet Parliament set you up to, in actual fact, provide the independent advice, why would you need another panel to work out, as was announced on the 6th of April, that we need more experts, apparently, on this issue? I mean, isn't this too many cooks?
Well, it depends on whether you are asking a different question. The question that Parliament says is give us advice to achieve the targets that Parliament has set. And Parliament set the target to be net zero, all long-life gases except biogenic methane, which is a short-lived gas, by 2050 and every calendar year thereafter. And on the way to get that, get a 10% reduction in biogenic methane from 2017 levels by 2030. So that was the task. What is the pathway to achieve that? And the Commission's draft advice is there are many pathways, plural. The government needs to exercise judgment about how the challenge and burden to get there should be borne within New Zealand society.
So to those people who would argue that the climate change are a bunch of woke activists, Rod, you'd say, we're not. We're in actual fact being told what to do by Parliament. We've got a job to do and we're going to try and do it as independently as possible. Is that right?
Absolutely. And the way you get on the board of the Climate Change Commission is through a nominating committee, so that's arm's length. And the nominating committee makes recommendations to the Minister. The Minister is obliged to do cross-party consultation before appointments to the Commission are made.
Okay, but I would listen, you and I know how the political process works in Wellington. If you're a friend of the government, you tend to end up on government boards. If you're not, you don't. Is there some suggestion that the composition currently of the board has the influence of one party over others?
Look, the process has this arm's length. You cannot be appointed to the Commission unless recommended by the nominating committee, but the nominating committee only recommends and governments choose. So it's a very similar process to how Governor of the Reserve Bank is appointed.
So it'd be the wrong question to ask you because you're just going to say, of course, you're suggesting, therefore, that none of those people who are currently on your board or employed as your chief executives or your policy staff have a particular policy axe to grind.
That is my belief, and certainly the evidence from their conduct and behaviour is that they do not have an axe to grind.
All right. Having said that, why has the government then decided that an independent panel of experts is needed on the issue of methane?
Methane is a very important issue for New Zealand because it is a large proportion of how the world looks at our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. That as the world sees it, half of our contribution is made through biogenic methane. That's small to the world, very important to New Zealand. The government, in its election campaigning, is responding to concerns about the sharing of the burden of meeting our obligations within New Zealand society. And it is for a government to decide the weight of burden to be borne in transport or energy or agriculture, and even within agriculture between sheep and beef and dairying. Those are judgments for a government, and the Climate Change Commission's work says you have choices here. You have choices about how much forestry you want to use as offsets. You have choices about which sectors should do more work and less work in order to meet our international commitments.
Okay, so here's a good example of this then. If the government makes policy decisions, is it your job as the Climate Change Commission to say, That's not going to get you there to net zero. That's not going to work. Or is it your job just to say...
No, it is. No, it is our job. We have a secondary job, which is to monitor and assess progress towards meeting emissions plans and the National Adaptation Plan of the government. It's not monitoring progress against our advice. It says at the end of the day, the government sets emissions budgets, the government decides on an emissions reduction plan, and we, on behalf of New Zealanders, report to all New Zealand on progress against the government's plan.
Can I ask you, does your advice take into, and it might not, because it might be much more science or evidence-based, but does it take into cognizance the socio-economic effects of government policies in dealing with climate change? For example, the cost burden. It does.
Yes, we are required in giving our advice to consider impacts, and Parliament was quite precise in some cases in saying impacts on communities, on iwi Māori, and the list of subgroups that the Act requires us to focus on ensures that we are alive to where the burden sharing occurs.